This video is brought to you by my official Metatron Frogmouth Night plushie, made in collaboration with Makeship. This is part of a charity event which I have initiated to help children with cancer. More on that later. Hello noble ones and welcome back to Metatron's Academy. Today we're talking about the difference in difficulty between French and Italian. So if you're thinking which one of these two should I learn and you're trying to base your decision on top of the difficulty of each language, well, probably this video will be for you. So we have a lot of ground to cover, but the things that I'd like to talk about today are, first of all, subjective versus objective difficulty when it comes to a comparative key between difficulty between Italian and French. That's the first thing we're going to talk about very briefly. Then we will discuss pronunciation, grammar, and ease of use, or ease of finding situation where you can practice these languages. And finally, we are going to read a few Google answers that we can find to sort of evaluate them and see if they're actually telling it how it is. First and foremost, what is the difference between subjective difficulty and objective difficulty? Subjective difficulty when it comes to language learning, it has very much to do with where you're coming from. So if you are a Spanish speaker, for example, then no questions asked. Italian is going to be easier for you, not significantly easier, but it is going to be easier for you to pick up than French because there is more common ground and more areas of overlap between your native language, Spanish, and Italian rather than French. That doesn't mean, however, that you shouldn't pick French. In fact, difficulty shouldn't be, or difficulty alone shouldn't be the one master factor or deciding factor when you're trying to pick a language. If you're more interested in French as a culture, as a language, then and you've got reasons why you want to pick French, then ignore this point. But if you don't, and you're like completely neutral, which one should I choose? And you just want to base it on difficulty alone, and you're a Spanish speaker natively, pick Italian, it's going to be easier for you. Now, what about if you know some Spanish? Will it make it easier for you to the point that it would make sense to just try to learn Italian? That one really depends on your level, in the sense that unless you are extremely fluent, it won't make much of a difference. It will a little bit, but not enough to really make it a deciding factor. Okay, but what if you're coming from a completely different perspective? Let's say you're either an Anglophone, you speak Mandarin. Well, in that case, it becomes a matter of objective difficulty rather than subjective, because since you're coming from a completely different set of grammar rules and mindsets and pronunciation expectation, then we need to consider the objective differences between these languages. For example, when it comes to pronunciation, Italian is definitely easier than French. And when I say definitely, however, this doesn't mean the French is, oh my gosh, this is an extremely difficult language to learn. It's not. It's definitely, learning French, it's definitely going to be easier than learning Mandarin or learning Japanese or learning Korean or Arabic. So it's not like an incredibly difficult language, but when you're coming from an Anglophone perspective, managing to sound really good when you're pronouncing these languages or also learning how to read these languages, definitely easier in Italian than it is in French. And that is because Italian pronunciation is easy to learn and difficult to master, and I know that this is something that now we wave around for everything, but in the case of Italian, what I mean by that is that you can easily get to a point where people will understand you no problem. But if you want to sound very close to a native speaker and you want your Italian to sound quite sophisticated, then it will take a lot of time and effort to get to that point, and it's mostly because we have a 7-vowel system, at least in standard Italian, and the difference in perception between closed vowels and open vowels can be extremely difficult for a non-native speaker. But that's a very advanced situation, and that's why I say if you just want to get to a point where, well, people know you're foreign, but you're conversational, much easier to get to that point with the pronunciation of Italian and learning the exceptions when you're trying to read than French, because in French, spelling is quite complicated. Now, with that being said, English spelling is also nuts if you really think about it, the way you pronounce things, and it's an O, but it can be pronounced in so many different ways when you say to, so, money, pot. And it's still the same. I mean, English is nuts. So learning to read French can be complicated, particularly when compared to Italian, which tends to stick to rules. And once you learn how to pronounce a sound, you're generally speaking okay. Exception being like GN, GL, and a couple of situations like that. When it comes to grammar, they're actually very similar. And I feel that even though, yes, if we really sat down to examine the minute differences in grammar and conjugation between French and Italian, then yes, you will find clusters where, yeah, with conjugate things differently, but in general, if you are trying to approach these languages, grammar is not really going to be a significant factor between these two. Now, when it comes to how easy or difficult it is to find people to practice these languages, of course, very much has to do, it's both a subjective and an objective point, in the sense that subjectively, maybe you have a bunch of Italian friends, then of course for you individually it's going to be easier to find people to practice Italian with, so you would have to take that into consideration. Do you already have connections to Italians/French? And that's going to make it much easier for you to find people to practice with, which is a key element in reaching fluency and actually learning stuff, to create experiences that you can connect in your brain so that you can remember the words rather than just having a piece of paper and reading it over and over again. Keep in mind that there are a lot more French speakers than there are Italian speakers. So you live in New York and you can go to frigging Little Italy and you know already a couple of waiters that you can practice with. You've got a bunch of friends. If you are in Europe, however, it kind of depends, because of course France and Belgium and Switzerland speak French, but Italy and Switzerland also use Italian, and so it's not, and the distances are not that big. So if you live in Germany, pick either. Okay, noble ones, but please allow me to take a moment of your time to tell you about this. So this is a collaboration with a company called Makeship, and that's what they do. They make plushies that represent or have a connection with all sorts of social media content creators and YouTube channels. And in this case, this is a representation of me wearing my frog mouth helmet in my full plate armor. You can even see the blue of my army in doublet. And as the popularity of my channel has been growing constantly, I decided to try and use this visibility for something good and important. And that's why I'm going to give part of what I make from this campaign to help children with cancer. And also be donating quite a few of these nights to several hospitals, specifically for the children wards. So this could be something really nice that you could gift someone in your family. It could be a nephew, or proudly display him on top of a shelf. To remember that by getting your own frogmouth plushie, you did two things. You supported the channel and the work of a creator you like, and at the same time, you took part into something important and good to be able to help those children that unfortunately weren't as blessed or as lucky as many of us are. So thank you so much for listening to me. We've got 21 days to make this happen. Please order yours today through the link in the description box. And once again, thank you so much for your support. Last but not least, let's have a look at what Google tells us. What's harder, Italian or French? So the first thing we read is from Babbel.com. All in all, difficulty probably shouldn't be a major factor in your decision, absolutely, because they're fairly equal in that regard, but you'll probably find that Italian is slightly easier than French. I agree. I don't know if they would actually give you an answer to that, but I do agree Italian is slightly easier than French, coming from, for example, an Anglophone perspective. But once again, if you come from Spanish, then remove slightly, it's going to be quite easier for you to pick up. Quora, which language is easier, Italian or French? Let's see the top answer. Italian is simpler for an English speaker in several ways. When it comes to pronunciation, Italian has fewer sounds than French, most of which are close to sounds that exist in English. I'm not sure about close to sounds that exist in English, but I kind of understand where they're coming from. For example, let's have a look at the vowel E in English. So in Italian, that can be pronounced in standard Italian as in two ways. E. So open, closed. But then again, if you just pronounce it and speak like that, people will still understand you. You're just gonna sound either connected to some of those regions like Calabria or some areas in Sicily where they do pronounce it always open, or it might make you sound a little less sophisticated, your version of Italian. But it's absolutely fine. You don't have to know this difference, but if you do, it makes you sound sometimes closer to standard or to some other regions in Italy like Rome or Milan and Florence, etc. In French, however, you have three. You have E, and so yeah, it's a little harder from that point of view. When it comes to the O, I think we are the same phonetically. We have O, same in French. But of course, French has the uvula R, whereas Italian has the trilled R. So what happens if you pronounce both languages, but you just use an English R? Like a R. It's fine, I mean, you have an accent, but you can still communicate. It's not like a huge deal if you can't replicate the same R. They can both be demanding, and they can both feel a little uncomfortable for you. But I've met more people that can pull off a good rolled R like an Italian than people who can pull off a naturally sounding R in French, where sometimes instead they kind of exaggerate it too much. I mean, occasionally the French do too, but it kind of depends on where it is. Like in a word like raisin, Rodin, Paris, it's not like Paris, They don't speak like that, but they do it a little stronger when there is like a T, I think, like Patrick. They do make it stronger there, but in general, I have heard more people sounding a bit awkward when they are trying to pull off their r, whereas people that do the r. So that sometimes happens. I'll make a dedicated video on the r and how to do it in Italian correctly, because sometimes I even hear people that like sing professionally, like lyrical singing, and they exaggerate the r in Italian and make it sound awkward, kind of weird, but I'll make a dedicated video to that. Let's see what else they say. The grammar of French and Italian is close to being equal, but Italian might be a little more regular. In terms of vocabulary, an English speaker might find French easier because of the many loan words in English, but this advantage applies to Italian words too. I was about to say, I mean, when you say manual, I mean, in Italian, mano is hand, so a manual, it literally comes from that. From something like a handbook, if you think about it. It's, yeah, you have a lot of words like that in Italian too, and to be honest, I think they're all going to be similar anyways, because the majority of those words, not all of them, like in British English when you say aubergine, it definitely sounds closer to French, whereas in American English when you say, for example, I know you say eggplant in this case, but when you say zucchini versus courgette, in Italian we say zucchine. So it kind of also depends on what variety of English you speak, because depending on which one you do, occasionally one word might be closer than the other. But I think any English speaker will understand zucchine in Italian regardless. I don't know if any English speaker would understand courgette, or courgette. Finally, Italian is pronounced the way it's written, whereas French spelling is very different. I agree. When you say Italian is pronounced the way it's written, remember, it's a very basic introduction to Italian. Like, it is pronounced the way it's written, but you will still sound foreign unless you really dive into it, because it's not always the case. For example, stress is usually not indicated. So yeah, it's written T-A-V-O-L-O, but you don't know if it's tavolo or tavolo. By the way, it's the first one, tavolo. So that one is something that comes with experience. The stress is usually not indicated. And then, as I say, there is the difference between closed and open vowels. There are also situations in which you pronounce a double, even though it's not double. You do that in standard Italian. They don't do it in northern varieties, but in standard Italian, when there is an a, meaning at or in, and then it's followed by, for example, the name of a city, that will be doubled, even though it's not written as a double, and so it will be pronounced with a longer or stronger, more intense sound. For example, a Palermo, a Milano, a Roma, rather than a Palermo, a Milano, a Roma. Even though people do pronounce it like that, it's just usually they do it in the northern variety. In the whole of the south, all the way in the middle, up to Tuscany, we do double after the a, and that's something that it's not exactly written. So I will probably have to make a dedicated video onto all of these exceptions on how to properly pronounce Italian like an Italian. But it is true, however, that if you just pronounce it like it's written, you will sound a little foreign, but we'll understand you 100%. So pronunciation, much easier in Italian than it is in French. All right, number one, so which one are you going to pick? Are you going to learn Italian? Are you going to learn French? Well, let me know in the comments below, and thank you very much for joining Metatron's Academy.